Back in 2001, photographs showed Nicole Kidman walking out of her lawyer's office with her arms raised and a clear smile on her face. The image spread everywhere and people basically took it as relief, like a clean break, you know. Over time, that moment kinda became the symbol of closure in the public narrative. But later reporting and persistent rumors hinted at a different take. Music, instead of marking a clear ending, that moment might have actually lined up with a long stretch of silence, music shaped by pressures that went way beyond the marriage itself. From that angle, the divorce didn't necessarily bring freedom. It marked a shift in the circumstances she was operating under. Why Hollywood silence is rare, and why hers was kinda strange. In Hollywood, breakups almost never stay quiet. Public separations usually get followed by interviews, memoirs, or carefully managed disclosures through trusted media outlets. Even when details are limited, a narrative usually forms. Prolonged silence. Yeah, that's pretty unusual. That's why Nicole Kidman's response grabbed attention. After the divorce, there wasn't any public account of the experience. No big interviews, no later reflections directly addressing it. As time went on, the absence music of commentary became more noticeable than any statement might have been. Career milestones kept rolling in without personal context. Music journalists noticed the same pattern and started asking questions that just never got answers. Music. And this silence didn't happen alongside stepping away from public life. Her career was actually moving forward, awards, major roles, and growing influence in the industry. At the same time, though, she stayed pretty guarded about one major personal event. For some public figures, music silence usually comes with reduced visibility. Here, the contrast between professional prominence and personal restraint really stood out. Over time, some industry observers' music started interpreting that restraint less as avoidance and more like limitation. When a public figure with clear incentives, music, to speak chooses not to, attention shifts away from personality and toward possible constraints. The focus moved from why she stays silent to what might have happened if she had spoken. That question leads straight into how elite divorces are often structured. The NDA culture nobody really talks about. Confidentiality is super common in high-profile divorces. Non-disclosure agreements are frequently used to protect financial and reputational interests, and some reports suggest certain agreements go beyond the usual boundaries. Music. These provisions can limit what can be discussed publicly, implied indirectly, or even acknowledged at all. In this case, industry speculation has suggested that expectations of silence might have gone further than normal practice. The claim is that restrictions weren't just about the marriage itself, but also extended to related experiences or influences. Commentary from people familiar with high net worth settlements has been used to argue that terms like these aren't always open to negotiation. Breaking those boundaries doesn't just risk legal disputes. Public statements can spark reputational damage, strain professional relationships, music, and even bring long-term career consequences. In that environment, music silence can look voluntary, even when it's shaped by outside pressure. Ambiguity can also help reinforce compliance. Music restrictions don't always have to be spelled out to work. Implied consequences and industry dynamics can be enough. If the reports are even partly accurate, the silence might have reflected a need for stability rather than personal choice. Legal mechanisms can discourage music speech, but they usually operate alongside bigger structural forces. When institutions music protect themselves, not people. In the early 2000s, Hollywood often worked less like a bunch of independent careers music, and more like a network of institutions focused on risk management. Influence was concentrated within organizations that were seriously skilled at controlling narratives and limiting disruption. When personal conflicts went public, the priority was rarely music personal resolution. It was containment. During that time, the Church of Scientology was widely reported to have influence within parts of the entertainment industry. Accounts from former members and journalists described an environment where image control was treated as essential. Public narratives were managed carefully, and anything seen as a threat to institutional stability got addressed quickly. According to later accounts, reputation management followed an internal logic that left music very little room for individual discretion. Silence wasn't framed as punishment, music, but as responsibility. Compliance meant stability, while deviation introduced risk. And that a music risk was understood to have consequences. Enforcement was often indirect. Music outcomes didn't always involve lawsuits or public confrontations. Instead, consequences showed up slowly. Access started fading. Music communication slowed down. Professional relationships weakened. Opportunities narrowed with zero explanation. Music. The expectation was communicated without actually being said. In systems like that, people often adjust their behavior by watching what happens to others rather than being told directly. Caution becomes self-imposed once the cost of stepping out of line becomes obvious. Music. When institutions operate like that, even very famous figures can run into limits on autonomy. Fame doesn't remove leverage, it just changes how that leverage gets used. If this kind of calm, source-grounded analysis is useful to you, subscribing helps support more work like this. The children factor, the thing nobody wanted to say out loud. Custody arrangements after celebrity divorces are usually music described in restrained, neutral terms. Public statements highlight music cooperation, privacy, and shared responsibility. On paper, these arrangements often look balanced. But reports suggest the lived reality can be different, especially when belief systems and institutional influence intersect with family life. In this case, observers pointed out that while agreements suggested parity, day-to-day access seemed uneven. The children largely remained within one environment and belief structure, while their mother existed outside it. Over time, that separation became normalized instead of openly discussed. Allegations from former insiders have suggested that staying silent helped preserve whatever connection still existed. Public speech wasn't framed music as expression, but as potential disruption. Even neutral remarks could be interpreted as opposition, with consequences reaching far beyond public perception. This dynamic creates a seriously limited set of options. Silence might allow limited music access without real agency. Speaking out might offer agency, but risk deeper separation inside a tightly monitored environment. Music, this wasn't presented as a choice. It was more like an expectation. From the outside, restraint often got interpreted as dignity or maturity. But that interpretation can hide the reality that restraint might actually work as a survival strategy when alternatives are restricted. The absence of protest doesn't necessarily mean consent. What makes this dynamic especially tough is that personal relationships become leverage points. When in music, belief systems reinforce that leverage, control moves beyond legal music agreements and into doctrine. Under that framework, individuals labeled suppressive persons are treated as threats to spiritual music progress, and members in good standing are told to reduce or cut contact with them. According to these accounts, the designation isn't necessarily music announced publicly. It can be communicated internally and reinforced through social pressure instead of legal action. Once applied, relationships can become conditional. Contact might be limited, supervised, or discouraged. Rumors have circulated for years suggesting that Nicole Kidman may have been viewed through that lens after distancing herself from the organization. These claims remain unverified, but they mirror patterns described by multiple former members. Music. In that context, public criticism wouldn't be treated as simple disagreement. It would be seen as confirmation. Music, that's part of what makes the mechanism so durable. Speaking out doesn't necessarily challenge the label, it can reinforce it. Silence, on the other hand, preserves ambiguity and avoids triggering responses rooted in doctrine. If that framework applied here, then restraint wouldn't be passive. Music, it would work as a strategy aimed at preserving the possibility of continued connection. Because in music, once belief systems become central to decision-making, the terms of the conflict change. Which brings us to why her public statements were always so carefully worded. Music, for nearly 2 decades, her public comments followed a consistent pattern. When asked about her older children, the phrasing stayed short and restrained. I love my children. They are adults who make their own choices. Music. The tone stayed neutral, and elaboration was minimal. On the surface, yeah, these remarks can sound kinda generic. In controlled environments, language can also, music, serve a specific purpose. These statements showed affection without throwing blame on anyone. They acknowledged autonomy without straight-up challenging authority. They confirmed a maternal relationship without inviting conflict. Nothing in the wording questioned belief, music, systems, parenting arrangements, or past decisions. That kind of restraint honestly seemed deliberate. It hinted that there was awareness that even personal emotions can be taken as criticism in places where institutions see dissent as a threat. The approach also cut down the risk of things blowing up. There was no accusation for anyone to clap back at, and no bitterness to fuel the drama. Silence, paired with careful phrasing, left very little material for others to contest music publicly. Over time, though, some people read that restraint as distance or music acceptance. But neutral language doesn't automatically mean neutral feelings, you know. Sometimes it simply shows boundaries chosen to manage risk rather than comfort. The contrast became more obvious when placed next to her work. On screen, she performed vulnerability, grief, and defiance music. Off-screen, her public language stayed measured and controlled. Even as her personal statements remained limited, her professional output kept getting more and more prominent. Peak success, private isolation. At the height of her professional rise, public recognition intensified while private stability still felt shaky. Winning the Academy Award for the Hours marked one of the music most visible successes of her career. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate she made it moment. Like everything had finally clicked into place. But in later interviews, Nicole Kidman described that music period very differently. She spoke openly about feeling isolated during the time around her Oscar music win. Despite the professional praise, the recognition didn't magically fix what she was dealing with privately. Public appearances during that period reflected restraint. Interviews were composed, deliberate, and honestly pretty limited. Over time, that reserve was sometimes misread as emotional distance. Not many people stopped to think that restraint might have been management rather than detachment. Her performances during those years stood in sharp contrast to her public demeanor. On screen, she portrayed grief, fear, and vulnerability with real intensity. Off-screen, expression stayed tightly controlled. Work gave her structure and momentum, sure, but it didn't replace real connection once the cameras stopped rolling. Success didn't soften isolation. If anything, it made the gap between public perception and private experience even wider. That gap stayed unresolved for years, not because nobody noticed it, but because the existing narrative left zero room for it to be examined. Music. Why Keith Urban changed the equation. The arrival of Keith Urban introduced a totally different set of social and professional conditions. His base was Nashville instead of Los Angeles, which meant stepping away from Hollywood's tightly managed networks. That difference actually mattered, because it shifted the surrounding music expectations. His professional world focused more on craft and personal credibility. The relationship that developed was described as less shaped by public management and more rooted in vulnerability. Music, it wasn't framed as something guided by intermediaries or carefully structured to control perception. Music. That difference disrupted what had previously governed her private life. In this version of events, her relationships were no longer mainly shaped by systems that rewarded silence. Music, they were shaped by direct connection and more transparency. The emphasis moved away from emotional containment and toward mutual openness. This shift didn't erase earlier constraints, but it definitely changed the direction of influence. Instead of constantly adapting to protect institutions, she began building a personal life organized music around actual human connection. That change altered how she seemed to operate, both emotionally and practically. The relationship didn't mean difficulty or pressure suddenly disappeared. What it offered, in music, this framing, was greater agency, the ability to respond with honesty instead of constant caution. Crisis without cover-ups. Not long after her relationship with Keith Urban started, he entered rehabilitation for substance abuse. In many Hollywood relationships, a crisis like that is handled quietly behind the scenes. Legal teams and publicists usually shape the message to limit exposure and control timing. That typical playbook didn't really show up here. Urban's entry into rehab was publicly acknowledged without music trying to downplay or hide the situation. The way the crisis was handled stood out. There were no reports, music, of suppression through confidentiality agreements or carefully scripted distancing statements. Instead, the situation was addressed directly, no spectacle, no hiding it under the rug. Music. What made that moment different wasn't the crisis itself. It was the absence of institutional buffering around it. That stood in clear contrast to earlier periods of her life, when problems were absorbed privately and visibility was tightly managed to avoid disruption. In this case, imperfection wasn't treated like some massive reputational risk. It was simply acknowledged as part of the music reality. For someone used to years of restraint, that level of openness marked music a shift. It didn't undo all those cautious years overnight, but it showed that the way life events were handled was changing. The priority wasn't containment anymore. Music, as systems of protection faded into the background, the conditions that once enforced silence slowly started losing their grip. That opened space for a different way of living to take hold. Reclaiming her voice without breaking the rules. Over time, her public tone shifted in subtle but consistent music ways. There were no exposés, no public accusations, and no attempts to dig up the past in dramatic detail. The overall posture stayed respectful. Music. What changed was the nature of the silence itself. Instead of big disclosures, there was a reframing. In later interviews, Nicole Kidman spoke more comfortably about care, responsibility, and personal agency. When discussing her older children, the language stayed calm, and music direct. My job is to love them. The focus moved away from explanations and toward acceptance, music presented as clarity rather than withdrawal. That shift marked a move from music, defensive restraint to chosen restraint. Earlier, silence seemed shaped by caution. Later, it looked grounded in autonomy. The real difference wasn't in what she said. It was in what she no longer needed to hold back. Her role as a mother also found broader expression within her new family. Affection was expressed more openly, without the heavy moderation that defined earlier years. There were no obvious institutional boundaries controlling how emotions could be described. Externally, not much seemed to change. Internally, though, the balance had clearly shifted. She didn't challenge the old rules publicly. She simply moved past the need to live under them. The question that followed wasn't really about enforcement anymore, it was about duration. Whether the silence had been imposed, or whether it had just been carried quietly until circumstances allowed it to be set down. What stands out in this conclusion is the total lack of confrontation. Music, there was no public dispute, no legal reversal, and no clear moment when silence was officially dropped. Instead, the conditions that once required restraint gradually lost relevance. Over time, Nicole Kidman built a life that didn't depend on approval from those earlier structures. A stable marriage, a family rooted outside those systems, music, and a career built on lasting independence reduced the leverage those forces once music held. As those foundations strengthened, the need for silence slowly faded. That's often how influence disappears. It doesn't always end through open challenge, music, sometimes it just fades through disuse. Silence didn't end because someone revoked it. It ended because it stopped serving a purpose. The shift from survival to autonomy is subtle. Survival is all about managing risk. Autonomy allows for choice. When restraint becomes optional instead of protective, the underlying pressure weakens without any dramatic public reckoning. Seen this way, the idea of a binding contract looks different. It may never have been something that could be openly ended. It might have simply expired once proximity disappeared. Power depends on access. Music, distance weakens it. Independence neutralizes it. From the outside, continued quiet can look like endurance. In reality, it can also, music, reflect patience that eventually turns into freedom. This story explores how silence can be shaped, maintained, and misunderstood, and how power often works without open music force. Leverage, time, and restraint can be enough to narrow someone's voice, even for a highly visible figure, in ways the public rarely sees. What gives the story its meaning is how it resolves. There's no confrontation, no exposure, no big defining public moment. Change arrives through distance. Freedom doesn't come from a courtroom or a screaming headline, but through stability, autonomy, music, and a life built outside earlier limits. Silence doesn't end because it's broken. It ends because it no longer serves a purpose. From this angle, music, the focus moves away from what might have been hidden, and toward how independence is built. Stepping beyond controlling systems, music doesn't always require open defiance. Sometimes it just happens gradually, through time and distance. If you appreciate restrained, fact-aware narratives that explore power without flashy spectacle, consider subscribing. Some stories reveal the most when they are told quietly.